Eric started to experience regular episodes of sleep paralysis not long after his 30th birthday. Most people who experience sleep paralysis suffer terrifying hallucinations while they are unable to move. This never happened to Eric though. Instead, he hallucinated a cat sitting on his chest and purring. Every night he would wake up at around 3 a.m., unable to move, and then a cat would jump onto Eric's bed, sit on his chest and purr. Eric would usually fall back to sleep before he regained control of his body, as this was not a frightening experience for him. In the morning he would wake up to the sound of his alarm, and of course the cat would be gone. Although Eric's hallucinations didn't scare him, it still felt incredibly real. The weight of the cat and the feeling of its body vibrating while it purred was exactly the same as a real living feline. One time the cat had rubbed its head against Eric's face, and he could feel its cold, wet nose and soft fur. He didn't understand why this was happening, but he was grateful that it didn't cause too much disturbance, unlike other sleep paralysis cases he had read about. A few months after moving into his apartment, Eric's property manager stopped by for a routine inspection. Before leaving, she asked Eric if he'd been experiencing anything unusual with the apartment. Eric said no, and the property manager breathed a huge sigh of relief. "That's great," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything, but every single tenant before you has broken the lease early, claiming that the apartment was giving them sleep paralysis." "Oh, well, I have actually been experiencing sleep paralysis, but it's not scary or anything. No big deal," Eric replied. The property manager looked both concerned and confused. Then she forced a smile and wished Eric a lovely rest of his day. This had been an unusual interaction, but Eric didn't think much of it. He brushed off the sleep paralysis thing as a coincidence and went on with his day. While Eric was walking around the neighborhood, he stopped to talk to a woman from across the street. She was doing some gardening in her front yard and called Eric over to ask if he wanted some oranges from her tree. During their conversation, Eric noticed a large tabby cat, just like the one he saw during his sleep paralysis, walk over and rub its head against the woman's leg. She handed Eric the bag of oranges and said, "It was nice talking to you, Eric. I better go feed my big tiger now." Then she picked up the cat and went inside. Eric thought he must have seen the cat before. How else could he have conjured it up during sleep paralysis? The next time he saw the cat in person, it was sitting on the roof of his car. "Hello, big tiger," he said, and gave him a pat on the head. His fur was soft and thick like a koala's. Eric wasn't really a cat person, but he liked this one. It became a habit for him to get the big tiger a treat every time he went to the supermarket. The sleep paralysis dream never changed, and it never bothered Eric. A year after he moved into the apartment, the property manager and landlord stopped by to say hello and to congratulate him on being the longest-lasting tenant. "I was just about ready to sell the place before you moved in," the landlord told Eric. "Every single tenant before you has broke the lease after a couple of months." Eric laughed it off and invited the landlord inside for a coffee. A few days after the landlord's visit, Eric had an extremely unpleasant episode of sleep paralysis for the first time. A horrifying monster crawled around on the walls in his room. It looked like a cross between a haggard old woman and something you might find in the deep sea. It crawled up onto the roof directly above Eric's bed, then dropped down onto his chest. Eric tried to scream for help, but he was paralyzed. He tried desperately to catch his breath, certain that this would be the end of him. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from the balcony. His head was already turned to face the sliding door. which he always left open just enough to allow a bit of fresh air into the room. It was the big tiger. Somehow this very large cat flattened itself out enough to squeeze through the gap in the door and jumped up onto Eric's bed. The big tiger hissed at the haggard woman and she faded away. Then he resumed his place on Eric and just purred, just as he had every other night over the past year. Now that Eric knew it was the big tiger who had been keeping him safe the entire time, he couldn't help but worry what might happen if the cat was unable to make it one night. The big tiger was never laid again after the encounter with the old hag. But one day, Eric spotted a for sale sign outside the owner's house. His heart sank. Eric knocked on the door and asked how long until they would be moving. "I don't know how long it will take for the house to sell, but we'll be gone within the next few weeks," the woman replied. Feeling desperate, Eric asked if he could buy the cat for a large sum of money. Visibly concerned by Eric's nervous behavior and his unusual request to purchase the cat for much more than he was worth, the neighbor invited Eric inside for a cup of tea. He told her all about the cat, the sleep paralysis, and the past tenants. "I'm so sorry, Eric, but we love Tigger. I could never sell him for any amount of money. But don't you worry, we'll figure something out, okay?" she said sympathetically. Eric went home feeling defeated. He didn't think they would be able to find a solution to his problem, and he'd never find another apartment to rent as cheap as this one. A few days later, the woman across the road knocked on the door. She was holding a cardboard box that apparently contained a microwave. "I got you something," she said with a triumphant smile. "I don't see how a microwave is going to help," said Eric. "Just open it," she insisted, shoving the box into his arms. It was far too light to be a microwave. Eric put the box down and started to open it. A tiny paw shot out through the opening, catching him by surprise. They both laughed as Eric continued opening the box to reveal a small tabby kitten. "I got him from the same shelter Tigger was from," the neighbor said. Eric thanked her and gave her a hug. He knew everything was going to be all right. Debbie and Craig had a somewhat arranged marriage. They were both in their mid-30s, career-focused, and struggling to find a long-term partner, and so their parents had set them up. Debbie had desperately wanted children, but unfortunately, by the time she had married Craig, it was too late. And now, here she was in her late 40s, childless, and trapped in a loveless arranged marriage. Craig thought he had a pretty sweet deal. Someone to cook, clean the house, and take care of his needs. But of course, he made no effort to actually spend time with Debbie or make her feel appreciated. Debbie, feeling desperately alone, made the decision to adopt a cat from the shelter. Well, Craig hated animals, and when he got home to find Cinnamon the cat sitting in his favorite chair, he put her in a box and drove her out into the middle of nowhere to dump her. Debbie was devastated and spent the whole night crying. The next morning, though, Cinnamon was back waiting at the door to be let in. Again, Craig drove her out to the middle of nowhere, this time even further away. He was certain she wouldn't find her way back again, but somehow she did. Craig had to accept that Cinnamon was here to stay. Craig gave Debbie an extensive list of rules for Cinnamon, to control which furniture she could sit on, when she could be inside the house, and what cat food she was allowed to eat. Even though Debbie was the one who paid for groceries, Craig tried to insist that Cinnamon only eat the cheapest cat food available. Neither Debbie nor Cinnamon took any notice of these silly rules. About 6 months after Cinnamon joined the family, A feral cat started hanging around in the yard. Debbie felt bad for the cat, who was clearly struggling to survive, and started leaving food and water out. Craig didn't mind so much, as this cat was nervous around people and stayed outdoors. Though over time, the feral cat became more comfortable and started following Cinnamon into the house. Craig intended to get rid of this cat, but he could never catch it. The neighbors' cats also started to visit often. They always went home, but being constantly surrounded by cats made Craig uneasy. He could have sworn they were watching him, judging him. Craig started seeing cats outside his work. This made him paranoid. What if they were spying on him and reporting back to Debbie? That's crazy, he told himself, and tried to brush it off. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was going on. Craig's dreams were also filled with cats. In the back of his car, in the mailbox, the elevator at work, there was no escape. It was impossible for Craig to ignore, which got him thinking about the reason why. Why were these cats out to get him? It was something he had done a long time ago. Craig's dad was a farmer. To control pests on the property, he would go out shooting, mostly foxes and rabbits, but feral cats had also been a target. Craig used to go with him. As Craig got older, he started shooting too. He particularly enjoyed killing the feral cats, which escalated into killing the neighbors' cats. He didn't always shoot them. Sometimes he drowned them or lit them on fire. He justified this unspeakable cruelty by telling himself, "They're a pest. They eat native animals. It's their owners' faults for letting them out." Eventually, Craig was caught in the act, and the police got involved. He got off lightly, and everyone seemed to forget about what he'd done. After realizing that this was the reason why he was being targeted, Craig took a few weeks off work and locked himself in the study. He used a bucket to go to the toilet and survived off snacks that Debbie would pass through the door. Debbie was concerned about Craig's mental well-being, but not enough to do anything about it. He'd been a terrible husband, and she'd often wished she'd stayed single. One day, Debbie got home from work to find the study door ripped to shreds. She could hear muffled screams and went inside to find Craig being eaten alive by about 50 cats.